the Jungle, where we discuss social science and applications to business and society. My name is Doug Lepisto, and I'm co-founder of Sleeping Giant Capital and the Center for Principled Leadership and Business Strategy at Western Michigan University. Today, my guest is Richard Reeves. Richard is president of the American Institute for Boys and Men, which he founded in 2023 to raise awareness of the problems of boys and men and advocate for effective solutions. His 2022 book of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It, was named the Book of the Year by both The Economist and The New Yorker. We go beyond his book to discuss the role of cultural entrepreneurship in crafting new narratives for boys and men, implications for business, and the work happening in Kalamazoo to ensure boys succeed. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, are we ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. Whenever you are.
Okay. So Richard, this is probably the highlight so far of my year. I've been trying to track you down for, let's see, we've been going on probably about 6 months. You've been a busy guy.
Well, thank you for your patience. You know, you have the patience of Job, Doug. That's all I can say. And I'm glad that we're able to speak.
You know, it's like, you know, when you got Bill Maher lined up and all these great venues, I'm like, what's up with Doug here in the jungle in Kalamazoo? You know, obviously that would be at the top of your list, would it not?
Well, as you know, I'm a fan of Kalamazoo, having been inspired in part by Kalamazoo to embark on the book that got us to this place. So
yeah.
So I owe Kalamazoo a non-trivial debt.
So that was, I think, the point where where I became familiar with your work. Was this connection to Kalamazoo, and I live here in Kalamazoo, so I'm a professor, obviously, at the university, PhD trained. So I see young men. I see young men, and I see them up close. And I also wear a hat as an investor, and so I run an investment fund, and so I'm backing CEOs and buying companies. So and I'm also a dad. To a 9-year-old boy. And so all of those came together, and I saw your connection to, your book in Kalamazoo. And I thought, yeah, what you're doing is so important on so many levels. And I don't think it's as really well appreciated as it needs to be. And so I reached out because I would love to help amplify what you're talking about. And I've watched enough podcasts with you now that hopefully I'm going to ask you some questions that go beyond what you've already talked about in the past.
Right.
But I would
thank you for your kind comments. I really appreciate that, Doug.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's start off maybe with start with Kalamazoo maybe, and where Kalamazoo, how it illustrates this story around the state of boys and men in American society. So maybe we start what you observed. You call Kalamazoo a special place for policymakers. What does it show us and tell us about boys and men?
Yeah, so it's one of those interesting things. Is another confluence in my own life, which was that I'd previously done quite a bit of work on promise programs. In other words, programs that pay for college for people from certain towns or states and so on, and actually hadn't found very good evidence that people have done good evaluations of those programs. What impact does it have to kind of essentially make college free for young people from a kind of particular place? So I'd done that work, and then I was separately doing a lot of work on what was happening with men later on, like men in college. We can get into that, I'm sure, but the decline in male college enrollment and completion. And then Kalamazoo stood out as somewhere that did have a very generous promise program. So the Kalamazoo Promise, as probably most of your listeners will know, offers full tuition for those who graduate from Kalamazoo schools to institutions of higher education in the state, and also had a very good evaluation from the excellent scholars at the Upjohn Institute. And so that's pretty unique, right? You've got a generous promise program that's been properly and robustly evaluated. And what it found was that it had a huge and positive impact on college completion rates among women from Kalamazoo, but had no effect on college completion rates among men from Kalamazoo. There's a bit of nuance to sort of the findings, but that's a kind of stop you in your tracks moment as a scholar. It's a wait, what? Hold on. reread it, get someone else to read it, reach out to the scholars as I did. I know Brad Hirschbaum a bit, and so reach out to the people and say, "Did I read this correctly?" Triple check, and it was true, and it to me illustrated part of a broader trend, which is that there are actually quite a lot of interventions that just in education, especially, that seem to just have a stronger effect among women and girls than among boys and men, which hints at a deeper problem perhaps than policymakers are used to dealing with.
And shout out to Tim Bardick, good friend of mine. Works with my wife pretty closely on some of her work on early childhood education in the city. Because shout out again to my wife. I told her I would shout her out on only a couple minutes into the podcast, because the answer to how we start thinking about the effects and changing the trajectory of boys and men, I would imagine, really starts at that earliest level. And you point out the importance of being able to redshirt boys. What kind of traction are you seeing around that kind of initiative to focused at the earliest ages and redshirting boys? Well, how is that prescription that you offer been received, and where do you see it actually taking hold?
It's been very interesting because it's really one of those proposals that divides the practitioners from the scholars. There's a lot of skepticism among scholars around this, including scholars who I can deeply respect and actually whose work I draw on for my own analysis of early years. So Diane Schatzenbach, for example, she and I just went head to head in a series of journal articles about redshirting, which you can see on the website of the American Institute for Boys and Men. It's open access to everybody. And that was from the Journal of Policy and Management. And so it's very interesting that when you try to get good quality evidence for the effectiveness of something like a later school start for boys, especially, it's kind of hard because it hasn't been done in a way that has been amenable to high quality evaluation by and large. And so among like a lot of scholars, people like that's sympathetic to the idea of trying to help boys, were like, well, the evidence base is not quite right. And actually, I do myself emphasize the need to pilot these programs. Meanwhile, among educators, people who work in schools and work with kids, they go, well, obviously you should start boys a year later. So it's like it's very complicated is the answer you get from scholars, and it's kind of well done from educators. And those are different kinds of knowledge bases. And I don't want to say, of course, I'm not going to prioritize one over the other. But it is nonetheless interesting that people with kind of lived experience of teaching are like, yeah, that would be great if you could start the boys a year later, which is my proposal. Although I've amended my proposal a bit now to say that actually just a few months later would probably be fine. It doesn't need to be a whole year because it's really the summer-born boys, depending on the age cutoff that you have. In terms of traction, what's happened so far is that there are some legislators or administrators in various school districts and states who are very interested in doing some pilots of this. And we're putting them in touch with some academics to do the evaluations. And so we're in the early stages now of potentially getting some pilots off the ground in probably 2 or 3 different US states. But none of them are at a stage yet where I can talk about them publicly. And with all of them, I'm just saying, let's do it small, let's pilot, let's kind of see what happens with this kind of proposal. So it's early days yet, but I didn't expect there to be an immediate pickup from this kind of idea.
Yeah. So what I loved about your book is it highlights something that I see both. I mean, as a dad, I get concerned about, as a educator, I see, and as a employer, I'm hoping to mitigate in the long term. How did, and you have sons, but not everybody who has sons writes a book like this. So what's your personal connection to this work?
Well, it's the combination of the conversations over the dinner table with boys, now young men. They're all my sons now in their 20s, and I raised them in both the UK, where I was until 2012, and then the US since then, and the social science that I was kind of running into in my day job at the Brookings Institution as a policy wonk. So it's one of those things where the sort of policy wonk in me was probably seeing stuff that I was more sensitized to as a father of sons and hearing about. And then I would kind of dig a bit deeper perhaps than I would otherwise have done. And then I'd bring that home and then talk about it kind of with my sons. And so it was one of those things where the work was kind of generally bouncing between the kind of personal and the intellectual. But the other thing I discovered as I talked to other parents, particularly of sons, about this, was that many of these concerns that we have about our boys are quite common. So privately, it was sometimes it felt like it was all anyone could talk about, right? I think I say in the book that at one point there was like a code for parents talking about a student or a child that was struggling in school, struggling to remain focused, kind of drifting, etc. And we'd go, "You mean he's a boy?" And so it became a kind of code. And yet all of those people would have seen that as just their issue, probably not as a public issue. And so the connection that I attempted to make in the book, and really it was the one that I was just making in my own life, was between the public and the personal. It was basically saying this isn't just a series of lots of private problems. This is actually a much broader and public problem, which was hard to say because at that point anyway, it felt somewhat risky to talk about the problems of boys and men in a way that wouldn't make it seem as if you were somehow negating the issues of women and girls, which we might get onto. But it was very interesting. It's very interesting to me to sort of make it very personal. They're just incredibly progressive feminist mums who are desperately worried about their boys.
And so
right, that's an interesting demographic.
So what is your experience around the risk of saying it? What is it like now? You said it was risky before. Is it still risky to say now?
Well, it's interesting because people told me it was risky, which of course is why one of the reasons why I felt the need to do it. But not, again, not to be clear, not because I thought, oh, great, this is awesome. You know, I don't think have a particularly high appetite for risk. It was more just the sense, well, if that's true, basically it's the sense of like, you're not allowed to talk about this if you're in a certain tribe. So if you're in think tanks or, academia or, the Biden administration, or there's certain spaces where it just kind of wasn't acceptable to talk about. Which meant, of course, but that didn't mean it wasn't being talked about. Because the other thing I learned from my sons, of course, was that there was a huge conversation going on online, especially about being a man and masculinity and what does it mean and so on. And of course, this huge rise in these influences. So what was happening? It wasn't that our reluctance to have the conversation around, the polite, liberal inclined dinner tables of the upper middle class meant that it wasn't going to happen. It was still going to happen. It's just that we weren't going to be in it. And so we're basically benching ourselves from a conversation that actually our sons were deeply embroiled in. And that just felt incredibly irresponsible to me, just because of perhaps some concerns. That said, since publishing the book and now launching a whole think tank on the issue, I've been pleasantly surprised by the fact that there is a huge appetite for this work as long as it's done in the right way. And that people were wrong to say that this was a risky enterprise because people have sons. You have a son. We have sons. Mm-hmm. People have husbands, brothers, etc. And again, as long as you don't set it up as a zero-sum game and you do it as compassionately and as empirically as possible, it turns out that this is just work, right? And so I've been pleasantly surprised and sometimes honestly quite moved by the positive response that the work has gotten.
Mm-hmm. And I don't want to get into the book because people can read the book and they've done enough. They have enough podcasts about you, about the book.
No, they should buy the book. Right? They should. Well, definitely stop there.
Stop there. And you should read the book. Right. And I mean, I took away, I tried to summarize the book in, 5 sentences, and it was things are worse than you thought. They're worse for lower class and minority men. The problems are structural. Interventions don't help men, and we're at a political stalemate. And so part of me says that you have really, it's we can go through all of the data and the explanations for these differences and the size of the differences and the policy prescriptions that we can be done. And the one thing that I thought that really, and you kind of have just touched on it, is the importance of cultural entrepreneurship in this moment about boys and men. That there needs to be, so much of your book points at new narratives and new meanings associated with that role and that identity. And that, to your point, there's certainly the need for conversation and awareness amongst, the people who are in the position to make policy decisions. But so much of this is, if we're not involved in the cultural arena, that, and I don't know who the we is in that sense, but people who care, that it'll be filled with other cultural voices. So how do you see the cultural entrepreneurship that needs to be done to be able to give new meaning and new stories to boys as they think about becoming men?
Yeah, I love that phrase, cultural entrepreneurship, around this issue. I think it's one that I shall be borrowing and then stealing
Well, okay,
from
so
you.
you didn't don't I, so I that's Marianne Glenn
Oh, okay.
and Mike Lounsbury have a strategic management journal, famous paper in organizational studies on cultural entrepreneurship and
Interesting.
new narratives that get done and new meanings that entrepreneurs use, particularly around new ventures.
Huh.
Marianne, I
That's
was at
super
Boston
interesting.
College, and
Huh.
Mike is at University of Alberta.
Okay, good. All right. So we're tagging it all along.
So now
I
it's
won't know.
it's an academic
I
thing,
don't
right?
know
It
if I'll
must be
say
true.
that. I don't know if I'll say that every time I use the term, but
Yeah,
I'll certainly not pass it off as
yeah.
my own. But I think that's right, and in some ways, it's the most difficult aspect of the work. I'm comfortable in the space of data and evaluation studies and pilots, and that's largely the work that the institute is doing. And I think that work is important and necessary because there's honestly just not much of it, right? Simple kind of data collection, just understanding what's going on with boys and men can be quite difficult because it's no one's job to be analyzing the data and projecting it in the way that we are. But I'm reasonably clear too that, as you just put it, that there's the need for a new narrative, or the kind of, I would say, the kind of contest over like what are the narratives around masculinity and what it means to be a man today is where a lot of the action is. It's not where I have decided to spend most of my time. I don't think it's my main contribution. I think that there are other voices who are in that conversation, and I would kind of point to people like Scott Galloway from
Mm.
NYU as being long-standing interest in this conversation. There are people like Chris Williamson, whose podcast Modern Wisdom just broke 2 million subscribers. And again, I don't agree with everything that they say. They have kind of obviously all kinds of different kinds of guests on, etc. But they're filling an important space, I would say, between the sort of wonkishness of some of the work that I do and the sort of factlessness of most of the more reactionary figures that you see over there. Both very kind of thoughtful men talking about this. And so there's a need for that. But the other thing I would say about this is, and I don't know if I'm right about this, but of course you want alternative voices and institutions online. But I wonder, it's a question back to you, given the work you're doing, that it sort of feels to me that it's in real life where we kind of really win, and that the best antidote, if I can put it that way, to some of the more reactionary figures that boys are like to find online, or young men or find online, is an actual flesh and blood man in their lives, in their family, in their community, in their church, in their scout group, in their workplace, in wherever. And so I don't think we can beat the online algorithmic mercenaries online. I think we can attempt to blunt what they're doing online, but I think we have to beat them in real life. And that's why I'm obsessed with like male teachers and mentorship programs and the role of men in boys' lives and other men's lives. So I don't know if that's true, but that's my instinct, and that we shouldn't. And there's more work to be done in real life.
Well, I mean, I think it's my own academic interest training is on organizations and with a particular attention towards ritual.
Mm.
And so, I think the narratives and the meanings piece is critical. And at the same time, the embodied ritual and some of these rituals, which have been kind of interesting for me, is if you look at some of the venues for these gatherings of men, have legacy meanings of the past that make them not fit of someone my age. I'm thinking of some of the country club or the supper club or some of these other institutions that were male dominated, male oriented for gathering and whatnot. Those feel a little bit out of step with maybe a more modern take, right? And so if you're somebody who's my age who's looking to be around other men besides the golf trip, you kind of get into a very there's not those the rotaries and these convening ritual kind of structures. I feel like those need to be built kind of anew at the same time that we get new meanings online in the narratives and the stories.
That's really interesting. I think that the male relationships, or those kind of male spaces you talk about, male friendship has been successively deinstitutionalized, that those institutions just referred to. And the reason why that might be a particular concern is if you believe, as I do, that male relationships require more institutional support than female ones. That's maybe a controversial claim, but like I just don't think it comes as naturally to men. I think, to put it sort of semi-jokingly, I think like men have to pretend to be doing something else in order to spend time with each other, right? And you mentioned the golf trip, but like, and men also communicate a bit more shoulder to shoulder. That's the main explanation for golf, I think. And so actually what's happening is that like the guy saying to the other guy, do you think I should use a 5-iron for this? Is actually saying, I love you. But it's just easy to say, shall I use the 5-iron? Whereas it's women are a little bit better at sitting in coffee shops, staring each other in the face, telling each other how much they mean to each other. And so they can have a long argument about nature and nurture here. But that's why I do worry about the atrophying of those institutions that you just referred to. But I have a question back to you, given your interest. This actually relates a little bit to the work Jonathan Haidt's work in his new book, and the chapter he summarized for us on boys and men. But he also has interesting stuff about rituals and the role of rituals. So do you agree with the statement that rituals are more important for boys in the process of becoming men than girls in the process of becoming women? At the average, of course. It's not going to be true for everybody, but on average, do you think that there is a greater role for rituals?
I mean, what an interesting question. My inclination is to say that men would. I mean, a great ritual is defined by shared attention and shared emotion, and usually they're built rhythmically. And that can be in conversation, that can be at a sporting event. So everybody benefits from that effort, the Durkheimian effervescence of the gathering. But there is a kind of a sense of solidarity that it gets really strong after those kinds of ritual moments. And I think for men, I think that provides that. I mean, they get it in sports, but that kind of togetherness. I don't know if it matters one more than the other. I just know that when I watch the 21-year-old leaders that I work with, who are working on professional projects on real business problems with real companies, that the women kind of gravitate together because they've got a connection as female leaders, and men do not. And they just right. And
it kind of creates a solidarity among them.
Yeah. I think you need, I think that manufacturing, and I think women are more relational. They can kind of get entrained with one another much easier than men can. The synchronization of men in conversation, emotion is so much more difficult, I think.
I agree. And that's why I do think I would say it is more important at the average, because it just takes a little bit more support, a bit more structure. And the other thing I have wondered about is that because the markers to maturity for women are somewhat more obvious biologically, obviously around kind of reproductive cycle, etc., and that those are kind of clearer markers along the maturity route and less so for men, again, all on the average. That may be why historically kind of societies have had to have more explicit rites of passage into adult masculinity for boys than for men, for boys rather than for women. And the trouble is, even talking about this, you can sound like a kind of 14th century, conservative. And so it's difficult to talk about, but just think about my own experience. I didn't have a rite of passage, like a single one that you might think of, but I definitely had a series of rites of passage. Definitely had kind of moments, and I think sports can do that, from the JV team to the varsity team. I have this incredibly vivid memory of the transition from being a Cub Scout to a Boy Scout. And actually the whole ritual around it was extraordinary. And I kind of remember that to this day, that kind of moment of kind of emerging. We had this kind of parachute thing you had to go under, and you went under it as a Cub Scout, and you came out as a Scout, and there was singing and all the stuff you talk about. And I remember that. I remember it quite strongly, that kind of sense of like moving up into this new status. And I could mention others, but I'm not suggesting that, of course, those aren't important for both sexes, but I think on the average, they're more important for men, and that we've actually allowed them to wither away somewhat because of our understandable, but now I think overstated suspicion of kind of these things and male spaces. And so one of the things I am on the record of saying is that I think we will look back on the decision of the Boy Scouts to admit girls. And not the other way around, of course. Girl Scouts remains for girls, and wonder if that was such a great idea.
Yeah. So one more question, and then let's pivot to more a longer term view. But in the short term, let's say my son is 9, and let's say I read the book and I'm saying this is really important, and I'm looking at his rituals that are around him, and I'm looking at his friends, and I'm looking at what kind of digital social media, video game influences, phones, everything that's around him. What does a dad do in that moment? What do dads do these days based on
Yeah.
what you've said?
Yeah. Well, and again, this is somewhat outside of my comfort zone because I'm constantly wanting citations for everything I'm about to say, but I can't provide it for everything I'm about to say. But I think the first thing is just like the fact that you're asking the question means that you're probably 75% of the way there, right? If you're a sufficiently engaged dad to be thinking about this and worrying about this, etc., that means you're engaged you're in your son's life, you're doing stuff with him, you care enough about him to be asking the question, and so you're probably most of the way there. Because like as long as he knows all that, which he will, then I just think like being around him and just being yourself. I mean, back to the discussion we just had about narratives and in real life, like kids believe their eyes much more than their ears. The way that your son is going to imbibe most of the messages about how to be a man is just from watching you. That's it. Just every minute he's around you, he's absorbing by osmosis. Like, what does it mean? And so, to some extent, you like, what's the cliche about be the change you want to see in the world? Well, you need to be the man that you want your son to grow up to be. Right? And the other things I would say a bit more practically are, I think just the value of kind of doing stuff together, fixing stuff together, going out together, being outdoors. And it will massively vary by kid. So I got one kid for whom the key thing was to allow him to tear the back off our refrigerator and repairing it using YouTube videos, and hold my breath while he did that and pass him the screwdriver. And he's probably 12 when he did that, right? But the other one, like when he's really struggling with some of his mental health issues, there comes a point where, and sometimes my wife notices it more with me, but I sometimes notice it too, is like, this kid needs to spend a night on a mountain. So we just have to hike up a mountain with our tents, and we have to build a fire and camp out. And then by the time we come down again, he's better, right? It's just like, and so that sort of stuff, and just kind of being around them is the best you can do. And then I think in terms of screens, my view on this is don't freak out so much about what your son is doing online. I think it's different for girls, by the way. Because most of what boys do online doesn't seem to be for video gaming and stuff, for example, isn't in and of itself harmful. In fact, join in. Like one of my sons still talks about finishing Far Cry 5 together. And you know, it's like you're so bad at it that it's funny for them as well, right? But the fact that dad's trying to do it with them, but just make sure that it's not displacing other activities, right? So I think video games are great. And also quite connecting. It's just that they're not great if they're displacing in real life friendships and everything else. And so I do think being kind of careful about that, but it's the extent of it, not the fact of it, that me, right? And just glory. I mean, it's so much fun, right? I mean, I don't know if you're finding this, but your son's 9. My God, you're coming. I mean, going to music festivals with my sons, going hiking with them. We went on this road trip once where I let them take it in turns to decide whether we're going to go left or right at every junction. And we ended up in the middle of nowhere, and it was 2 days out, and it was just a blast. And they still talk about that. It's like,
Yeah.
it's so fun, right?
Yeah.
Being a boy dad is just immense.
Yes. Yes. No, I think that's great. So let's I'll flip to another identity. So talk to me as an investor. You come by summer, we'll be responsible on behalf of our investors for, call it 200 jobs here in the West Michigan area. And so we're looking at how we optimize and grow those companies and create, really strong young male talent that wants to, come in, and female talent. And talk to me as an investor and as an entrepreneur about what are the implications of your work for business. What should employers be looking at in terms of dynamics that they have with new talent coming in or between generations? What kind of skill sets would you want to see be built in, higher education to facilitate, into business? What are those implications?
Yes, I think the first thing is that just kind of recognizing that, just depending on, especially if you're talking about young adults, just developmentally, there is a bit of a gap, right? That on the average, girls mature a little bit earlier than boys. That's part of the reason for the red shirting proposal we talked about earlier. And they're just kind of going into and through college with just actually slightly better developed executive functioning skills. They're a little bit more organized. They have slightly better future orientation. And they've also grown up. This isn't talking about girls and young women now. They've also grown up in a world that has been saturated with the messages around female empowerment, female autonomy. And that's created, I think, in young women a really kind of strong sense of agency and kind of purpose, which is great. But it's very important as a business or any kind of organization to make sure that that message is matched for the men, right? And that we don't inadvertently kind of signal to the men that they don't need any help, that they're just automatically going to succeed. Because actually, if anything else, the median 23-year-old guy has probably got a little bit more work to do than the median 23-year-old girl. And so if the only thing they encounter in the workplace is lots of stuff for women, well, then there's that asymmetry will start to kind of play out. And so I just think we're at a point now where we can recognize that fact, and in no way take the foot off the gas for women in the workplace, but also just make sure they're not inadvertently sending a signal there, which is that somehow the guy's concerns are less important or less valuable, etc. And I'll give a specific example of that, and then a really inspiring action that came out of it is just the issue of mental health. Obviously, that's a huge issue for businesses right now, taking that seriously. But the latest, this is literally the last couple of days, Jean Twenge, who you probably know, who's done the work on generations, she just did a new analysis. And she finds that the highest suicide rates now are among men in their 20s, higher than middle age now. They've overtaken middle-aged men with the highest absolute rates, which means, of course, that the total number of years of life lost is much greater, and it's very much higher, slightly more than 4 times higher risk of suicide among young men than young women. And so as an employer, making sure that your mental health providers, that your mental health messages are genuinely as oriented towards the men as the women is massive. Because right now, the whole issue of mental health tends to code a little bit female, both in terms of who's talking about it, who's providing it, the nature of the messaging around it. And that seems to me to be totally against the evidence. And so as an employer, just kind of, if you're interested in well-being, to use that word, wellness, which is a word I try to never use, that actually just like the men in your organization are in just as much need as the women, and they might struggle a bit more to seek the help. And so you might have to work a little bit harder, go a little bit deeper to get the men in your organization to really open up around their needs. And they may even be reluctant to do so. They might feel almost embarrassed to do so if all the messaging around them is, life's great for men. What are you talking about? So there can be, and inadvertently, a message can be sent that there's less empathy for the problems of men than for women, in our laudable desire to promote the cause of women.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's as someone who's seeing 21-year-old, junior seniors in college, the strongest students are 9 times out of 10 women. The leadership positions in the student organizations around our program are mostly all women. It can be very often that I'm downtown at Sleeping Giant Capital where I work, and it's 2 guys and 8 women in a private equity environment. Do you anticipate that this kind of continuing where, I mean, I see on the horizon, women are just so far outpacing men that just the constitution of these firms are just going to radically change.
Yeah, and I think that it's a difficult thing to balance because on the one hand, of course, the rise of women and the increasing share of women in these roles is a good thing. And there's a lot more work to be done in some other places. It's just making sure that we're updating our views about the work we need to be doing for gender equity in line with the current data. Because you see the data, I mean, you just kind of referred to your own experience, and of course, with your scholarly work, you know that's true more generally, right, in terms of those outcomes. And so the trick here is to talk about the fact that we now need to do into higher education for sure, at least as much, and in fact more for men than for women, in a way that doesn't come across as saying we should dismantle the support structures that are in there for women. That, I had enough of this women nonsense. Let's go back to the 50s. And that's the trouble, is that because that's a hard message to deliver, many people just don't try. But that just leaves this huge vacuum where we're just not able to talk about or act on behalf of young men without in some way seeming to be anti-women. And so that's the difficulty. I worry that if we don't do more quite soon around some of these narratives, but also the policies, etc., that there is a generation of young men who we will not get the best of. So I don't think I'd say it more strongly than that, but I think we're leaving a lot of talent and human capital on the table now in terms of gender, and in not the way that we're used to thinking about that. And I think that too many of our leaders and institutions, who typically are a bit older, now I'm in my mid-50s, and so this is an issue for me, are still basing their view about the relative position of women and men on their own experience, or even the generation before, rather than on the current reality. And that failure to kind of update our views in line with the data, I think, is causing a huge problem. And so my criticism of contemporary feminism, particularly in the culture, is less that it's wrong and more that it's out of date. It's just not quite caught up. Even these, even just some of the cultural messages you kind of see out there, a lot of young women are like, yeah, that's not really the issue anymore. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's not high heels or whatever it is in the Bible. That's not the thing. And I'm not, for a moment, of course, right now in the US, huge issues for women, not least around access to reproductive healthcare. So I don't want to in any way sound like I'm diminishing them, but it's just, we're not catching up with the reality.
Yeah. So let's round out here with what keeps you kind of creatively inspired. So and how you, in your writing routine, your writing practice, you produce a lot of work. What has helped you be so, prolific in your writing, your thinking, getting your ideas out there? What's worked well for you?
You know how some people have their sort of routines, and they'll say so, and you listen to them and you're like, well, I block out this number of hours a day and I do that, and I'm like, God, that must be amazing. So I think the first thing to say is that I've always been much more intrinsically motivated than extrinsically. And so I have to, if I believe in the work and the importance of the work, I'm all in. I find it very difficult to do work that I'm not. I mean, this is going to sound very male, but and someone told me the other day that what did he call? He said that a friend of his talked about his attention deficit superpower or something like that. I can't remember the exact terminology, but it was specifically about how, look, we develop these what were quotes learning difficulties, and I've definitely had my share of those. But actually, one of the things that's come out of that is a hyperfocus. And so when I get, and this is not very helpful, right? So I'm just caveating this is not, there are no tips here. I'm just describing my own truth, which is that when I get locked onto something like the book, I get up absurdly early. I don't set an alarm. It's not a plan. I don't do 20 push-ups and look at the sunlight and then have a tea. I get up and I go to my desk and I work. And I work till I drop, and then I do it again and again and again. And I can think about almost nothing else. I'm obsessive. I'm completely hyper-focused on it. Everything else goes to hell. And I do it, and then I've done it, and then I move on. So I'm always like, you catch me, and that's it. I'm all in until it's done. And that's kind of more been historically my process. I've tried all kinds of techniques to try and routinize it, but I'm just incredibly driven and of the moment. And the most difficult thing for me has been to learn to just trust my instinct, trust my intuition, do the work that I'm called to do, and trust that the world will listen and kind of reward it. And that's been hard to do, but I have learned to do that. And I've had plenty of failures along the way, but I've just kind of realized that, like, the question you get in interviews, where are you going to be in 5 years? I've always thought anybody who had a good answer to that should never be hired, because, like, how in God's name, I don't know what I'm going to be doing in 2 years. If you'd asked me 3 years ago, like, oh, I'm going to be president of the American Institute for Boys and Men, but what's that? What? Like, this was never in the plan. I didn't want to do this. What's happening? And so I just, yeah, I'm anti-strategic in my approach to work. Let's put it that way.
So last question then. So be a little bit playful and think for us, where is this work taking you in the next year or two? What are you most excited about? You're now president and founded, the American Institute for Boys and Men, raise awareness for the problems boys and men face and how to help them. What is exciting for you about your work in the future?
Yeah, so it's actually quite a boring answer, although you've encouraged me to be playful around it, but it's intentionally so. But one of our mottos in the Institute is keep it boring. And as one of my sons said when he heard me say that, he said, well, you're the man for that job, Dad. Because they're funny as well, aren't they? But the thing that, like, we're trying to do this quite slowly. We're trying to make the study of and advocacy for boys and men a mainstream pedestrian issue. We're trying to make it not controversial. We're trying to make it just solid. Just, of course you'd have policies to try and help men in higher education. Why the hell wouldn't you, looking at the data, right? But right now, that's sort of feels like thin ice to people. So this is a metaphor that's occurring to me now, so it might not work. But we're trying to make the ice thicker until it becomes solid. And it's like, of course you would look at male suicide. Like, why wouldn't you, right? So to make it mainstream. And so the thing that excites me actually is not the sort of, clicks or viral thing or it, some big audience for something. It's actually when quietly you just see a policymaker citing our work. I just saw an interview with the Surgeon General, and he was talking a lot about these issues in a way that I thought was really positive. You can see people like citing some of our statistics and just getting a citation in academic journal, that kind of stuff that previously I would have much less interest in, honestly. And it's not about the cultural change, but it's about mainstreaming the issue. And so I hope that a year from now, this issue will be even more boring than I've tried to make it to this point, in the sense that policymakers, from schools to higher education institutions to government departments, are just able to have initiatives and research programs around boys and men and not be looking over their shoulder, because there's no one coming for you. There's no one over your shoulder. It's just straightforward work. And so trying to make this space a bit safer, but it is the slow and hard boring of hard boards, as Weber put it. The nature of the work is not flashy. It's not clickbaity. In fact, it's intentionally not so. And so right now I'm getting excited by lots of small things rather than one big thing, which is a different mode of working. But I'm incredibly proud of the work that we've done. I love your way of thinking about it and your framing of it, because if you've got a son, if you're working, if you care, of course this is an issue. And to the extent that we can help people address it responsibly and compassionately, then that's good. I don't see myself going anywhere except doing this work for the
That's
foreseeable
great.
future.
That's great. Well, I am such a huge believer in what you do, and it's so important. I mean, I see it on so many levels as being important. So hopefully this helps spread that message and gets out to more folks, here in West Michigan. So Richard Reeves, you're the president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. They can follow you on Twitter. They can follow you on, is that where you're most active?
Yeah, getting more so on LinkedIn actually. But if people
LinkedIn?
go
Yep.
to the Institute website, they'll find everything there. It's aibm.org is the website address for most of our work now. So do check that out. But I'm on all the usual socials too. And I want to thank you for the conversation. I really loved it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It was so much fun. Thank you.